everyone and welcome back to the channel, and to our first video in our Scotland mini-series. Formerly a castle that was bitterly fought over during the Scottish Wars of Independence, the Jedburgh Castle Jail and Museum details the history of life in a 19th century prison. It's actually considered to be one of the most haunted jails in the country, and in this video we will give you a tour and will take you through the long history of the castle, the jail and the surrounding town. Jedburgh Castle Jail was built in 1823, purposely resembling a castle to pay tribute to the medieval castle, Jedburgh, that once stood on that same spot. The 12th century Scottish castle was originally built by David I, but as a royal castle. In fact, his grandson and his successor, Malcolm IV, died there in 1165. It changed through hands numerous times between the Scottish and the English, but when William I was captured by the English, in order to secure his release, the Scots agreed to hand over 5 of their castles to the English, and this included Jedburgh. It was only 15 years later that Richard the Lionheart returned them for money, and so it was that Jedburgh Castle's ownership went back and forth. Alexander III, who became King of Scots in 1249, was married at this castle and was said to have been visited by a ghostly apparition who foretold his death. This apparition was said to have appeared many times, always with similar and morbid warnings, which actually came true when Alexander fell with his horse from a cliff at Kinghorn. In 1246 it again came under English rule, and stayed that way up until 1409, when the Scots finally managed to retake it, and tiring of the English, decided to demolish it once and for all, so that the English could not use it as a fortification against them ever again. It didn't work though. Castle or not, the English continued to raid and plunder Jedburgh. The site was later used for executions and became the site of the Jedburgh Gallows, and the name Gallows Hill still remains. It was also known as Jedburgh Justice, on the context of hanging them first and asking the questions later. It's now a beautifully thought out and clean location. You wouldn't believe it was once a jail, but there are plenty of stories of ghosts, stories of the people that lived and worked here. It's an eerie and haunting atmosphere waiting to whisper its past. Finally, in 1823, what little remained of the old castle was removed, and the Jedburgh Castle Jail was built in its place. It was built as a Howard Reform prison, which in 1773 John Howard had been made High Sheriff of Bedfordshire, and took it upon himself to visit prisons and inspect them. He was absolutely appalled about the conditions and visited more around England. He put proposals forward so that these conditions would be improved, as John felt that some of the prisoners would benefit from being reformed rather than being punished, and worked towards this. After he died in 1790, the Howard Association was formed, which was a charity group that continued this work. The Jedburgh Castle Prison was one such reform prison, and is the last Howard Reform prison left in the country. The castle jail shut its doors in 1886 and now operates as an interesting museum that we get to walk around. The Victorian Jedburgh Castle Jail housed men, women and children, and was mostly used as a debtor's jail. It was a harsh prison, and conditions were bleak, with much cruelty taking place within the jail. There were executions at the jail, where the criminals were hung on the gallows, and this included Thomas Wilson, who was executed after being found guilty for the murder of a young shepherd at St Boswell's Fair. It was later discovered Thomas Wilson was actually innocent. Perhaps he is one of the ghosts who walked this earth to prove his innocence. A separate Bridewell, which was known as a House of Correction, was built in 1789 by architect Archibald Elliott. He produced a beautifully fine castellated structure, with separate prison blocks and an exercise yard. John Howard's reform prisons were thoughtfully designed, to enhance the mental and physical health of the prisoners in order to help, encourage and reform them. The plan and furnishings were also very carefully considered. There were, of course, rules for hygiene, food, exercise, and good standing order of the wardens, and the prisons were also regularly inspected. Later, in 1847, in line with the new and harsh guidelines that were laid down by the Prisons Act of 1839, the prisoners were confined into their separate cells. The first block of rooms that we head into are the first of the cells named the Bridewell. As we head inside, it's not what you would normally expect a prison to look like and feel like. The cell block was originally run separately from the rest of the jail up until 1830. It was built to hold petty criminals and vagrants. The conditions that they would have had to go through would have been harsh, dull, but a way to encourage you not to reoffend. Inside there are 16 individual cells, all dull in colour and the same as each other, repeating with no day room or rooms at all for the prisoners to exercise, just showing how bleak the conditions had to be, although they at least had grills in its doors and in the ceilings for ventilation. This cell block is the least altered of all of the buildings, keeping to its origins. It's also said to be the most haunted part of the jail. So many visits from the investigators, budding paranormal enthusiasts, and just people exploring have said to experience a number of odd happenings here. Batteries on their equipment suddenly depleting and not being able to record. The sounds of a piper playing the bagpipes gently through the air, and the faint sounds of whistling throughout its corridors, which could be the jailer doing its rounds. I mean, this place is a haven for the paranormal. On our visit, it was quite busy, and we were there during the day. But in the evening, once everybody has left, I can imagine the cell block to be quite the intimidating place. The famous TV show Most Haunted has been filmed here, which has opened up people's eyes to the possible hauntings inside these lonely cells. And it does make you wonder if these cells are haunted with all of the harsh treatments that the prisoners had to go through. Are they still lurking in the rooms warning people off, or just lonely? Prison life was different for many criminals. Sadly, the vagrant was normally picked on. They were given no midday meal, and their supper and breakfast, being the same, consisted of 2 pints of porridge and a half pint of milk. There is a small area in the exhibit museum with some insight into prison life and what the prisoner would do once they walked through the gates of Jedburgh jail. This room was in the governor's house, and it was the first port of call for the inmates. A round turret room was a washroom, with water drawn from a well, by the pump at the door. It's here that the prisoners would be bathed, weighed, and given a haircut, and then they would also find out names and anything else that they needed to know before entering into the cells. They were also assessed and asked if they were fit to do labour, details of what brought them there in the first place, and it was the place where the punishments would be recorded in the prison register. Some of the crimes committed by children have been written down here, and some of them are quite sad to read. One example is of a young lad named Robert Rennie, aged 9 years, who was convicted of theft of a whip and 2 candles. His punishment was 4 days in prison. Another was Mary Boyd, aged 13, who stole a considerable amount of money. She was held in the prison for 30 days and 4 years in a reformatory school. The female cells, in my opinion, were completely different. They felt new, clean and very well maintained. I can imagine that when the women were in these cells, they were treated a little bit more respectfully and given more luxuries and leeway. Although for inmate Catherine Maybon, she was housed here at Jedburgh, she was a vagrant who was not able to read or write. Her crime was theft of potatoes, to which she had come here for 30 long days. Maybon would have had to have worn the prison uniform, which for ladies was a striped cotton gown and an upper petticoat with an apron, woolen drawers and a cotton cap. As she was unable to read, a Bible wasn't actually placed in her cell. Some of the tactics of punishment throughout the prison was using the silent system. All of the prisoners were to be confined into their individual cells, but if working, they were to be completely silent throughout the day, and if they disobeyed or broke the rules, they would be locked inside their cells without candles or light and punished. The inmates were known by numbers and not names. It's not surprising that a large portion of the prisoners were driven mad. The jailer's house was obviously attached, with the Jedburgh jailer living in residence. He would have lived here in a 2-roomed flat with his family. His wife would have usually worked as a matron and would have attended to the female prisoners. The jailer also had an assistant who lived here, but in one separate room flat. He would have been paid from the jailer's income. The building that these rooms are housed in also contain the prison kitchens, a separate room for the female debtors, and a stateroom used for people accused of treason. The architecture of the whole jail was clever and thought out, and reflected the reformed prison life they wanted to bring to the forefront. The first floor has 3 wooden bridges that lead straight into cell blocks. This allowed the jailer to have easy and quick access to the upper cells, or a perfect vantage point for keeping an eye on what's going on in the exercise yard. There have been records of at least 8 jailers living here over its time, including John Anderson, who was a jailer here between 1871 and 1881, along with his wife Margaret and their 6 children. Now this building is home to the wonderful museum, with so much to look at and appreciate and spend some time. The visit to Jedburgh Jail is completely free, which is incredible, and you're able to offer a donation to be able to keep the charitable organisation going, and free to visitors and tourists alike. They have an abundance of history and information, dating back from Roman times to the present day, with a moving and clever way to understand the criminal system at that time. It's well worth a visit, and one on the Scottish borders that is a must visit, as is the town just a few metres away. So that's it for this week, and part 1 of our Scotland mini-series. We've really enjoyed visiting here at Jedburgh Jail, and hope that you have too. If you have, please be sure to hit that like button, consider subscribing to the channel, or consider joining our Patreon or channel memberships to keep the content going and to encourage us to do what we love bringing to you. We want to say a big thank you to our channel supporters and to our Patreons. So we'll see you on the next one. Till next time.